Yes. Hello, Professor Fakri.
Welcome,
Your
welcome,
sound,
Dr.
your
Welcome.
sound is off. Your sound is off.
Vishal, can you just switch on the sound?
Okay, now it's working.
Good
Yes,
afternoon.
we can hear you. Well,
Thank you.
Dr. Padari, the time is there, 4 o'clock?
yes.
It is about 2 minutes left. That's it, basically. But up to you. You can start if you want. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I can start.
Yeah.
We have just changed some slides here. So welcome to VI Certified Digital Vein Life Symposiums. And, as there are many little conferences will be happening this year. So we'll try to have you involved throughout the year with the series of VI Certified programs. And we are thinking of newer ideas. And we are also thinking of going live from June and July. So you see all the people who are expert in this field, you can see them here. So they can demonstrate one live case per session, and then we can discuss that live case for 1 hour. So something we are thinking of all this planning in the future. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, Servier, for such a help to us to organize this events. As you know, Servier is a non-profit organization, and it's the second French pharmaceutical company. And you can look into the revenue, what they make, but the important thing is that they invest a lot into the research. So all their products are manufactured in France, so that there are no Chinese raw material which is coming. So they really like to thank all the frontline heroes who are fighting against the COVID-19. And we also really like to thank them. This is another initiative which has been taken up by Surya Pharmaceuticals. So the VI is very actively involved in this, and it's called as We Move. So it's a movement against and to teach you all about the chronic venous disease awareness programs. And its Facebook will be launched tomorrow on an International Women's Health Day. So I will really like all of you to go to this page today, join it, like it, and also look into the launch tomorrow in a big way. There are a lot of people who has got involved into this, and we are going to put in a lot of literature on it, and the VI will be actively participating in this. So that will be another one thing which we are going to do. Coming to today's lecture, Dr. Padaria is here. He doesn't need any introduction. You know, he's a past president of Venous Association of India, and he's the guy we all look up to in terms of how to build up the practice and how to conduct the venous treatment in the country. And there will be two panelists, Professor Ajay Khanna. He is also the executive member of our association, and he's professor and head of a very big medical university. We also got Dr. Satish Kumar, who is going to join us here as a panelist. He's also the executive member of the Venous Association of India. And I'll go to the next slide. Next session will be on 29th. That will be on duplex ultrasound investigations in chronic venous disease. So we will all urge you to join at the same time on Friday. So now I'll hand over the mic to the panelists. And Dr. Patari, I'm really sorry. You have to excuse me.
Not to worry.
And
Not to
I
worry.
hope I finish it before your talk finishes and join you back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I hand over the mic to Dr. Ajay Khanna and Dr. Satish. Please carry on the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Can you hear me, Doctor? Hello.
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul, for such an extremely good program which you are carrying out for such a long time along with the Surya Pharmaceuticals. And today we have got a very important presentation. In fact, there are two presentations which are there and which are to be made by Dr. Sohaib Padaria. I think he doesn't need any introduction to this society, but he is a consultant interventional cardiologist at Mumbai. He was the past president of Venous Association of India. He's the vice president of the Asian Venous Forum, and he's the council member of the International Society of Phlebology. And today he's going to talk on two subjects, and both are very interesting subjects in the sense that we never think about that, but that is a gist of the problem which is there. And one other thing which is going to discuss is about the thyroid disease and the CVI. I think probably nobody thinks about that there can be a association between the thyroid disease and the CVI. But somehow, in fact, I wanted to look into the literature of that, and I could just get only one article, and that was only abstract of that where in the 2018 in the Acta Phlebologica, there was an article that they looked into the thyroid disease association with the CVI, and they found that about 17% of the patients out of about 300 odd numbers who were there, they had the hypothyroidism. And then here and there I could see for some literature there, but in fact they were not very convincing literature was there. Thyroid disease is associated with any disease in the body. It can be associated with anyone which is there, but this is also the venous system can also be involved. Either the superficial venous system or the deep venous system can be involved in a patient with a thyroid problem. And most of the time it is a hypothyroidism which is there in these patients. And then the second very important lecture he is going to take is on the nerve injury during the various varicose vein procedures. In fact, it is not that it is just the EVLT or the RFA or any procedure, even the open procedures, they are all associated with the nerve injury, and it can be up to the range of 10% can have the nerve injury. You know, in the UK, the commonest single cause of litigation following the varicose vein surgery is because of the injury to the nerves which is there, which can be sometimes very difficult to manage, whether it is the sural nerve is there, or whether the saphenous nerve is there, or the popliteal nerve is there, or even the sciatic nerve which can be involved in your varicose vein surgery. And even in the EVLT, when you're doing the RFA, you can damage these nerves. And that is why the most important part of the tumescence which is there. And you know, if you look at the natural history of these nerve injuries, not very well described. And there's limited information about that what to tell to the patient, that what is going to happen to that patient. Is he going to improve completely from the nerve injury or not? How long he's going to suffer from that nerve injury? And what is the treatment of that? So there are so many controversial points which are there as regard the nerve injury during the varicose vein surgery. And I think Dr. Sohaib Padaria is going to discuss about both very important problems, the thyroid with the CVI and the nerve injury during the various varicose vein surgery. So along with my colleague, Dr. Satish is there. Has he joined, Dr. Satish? Dr. Satish? I think probably he has not joined. I
Yes,
hand over the mic to, you are there?
yes.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. So should we permit Dr. Sohaib to present his presentations?
It's an honor and privilege.
Right. Thank you very much. Dr. Sohaib, please.
Good afternoon, friends. Dr. Khanna, Dr. Satish Kumar, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's again a pleasure to be addressing all of you here today in this session. So today I'm going to speak on two topics, as Dr. Khanna said. I'm going to start off with the first topic, which is thyroid dysfunction and its association with chronic venous disease. Now, you know that sometimes in clinical practice, we think that there is an association between two diseases. But there is no much literature about it. It's just in our minds that I think there is some association. Many years later, somebody comes out with a paper saying that there is a statistical association. And we always felt that, yes, I always knew that many years ago. So in the last few years, I felt that when I was doing varicose veins treatment, somehow I felt that the number of patients who were having thyroid dysfunction was slightly significantly higher than I would have normally expected. And this basically led me to analyze 1 year of my statistics of patients who came to my clinic for general consultation for varicose veins treatment. And this is what led to this particular association with this topic. So let's first discuss exactly what is the relationship between thyroid dysfunction and venous insufficiency. Now, We know that thyroid disease, first of all, the first point we want to discuss is what is the association between these two conditions, between thyroid disease and venous insufficiency. What are the proposed mechanisms whereby these two diseases can be associated? What is the clinical evidence of venous insufficiency in thyroid dysfunction? And what is this association in our own series of patients? And finally, the key messages which are there, which I would like to share with all of you. I'm unable to go further. There's something blocking my. All right. So we know that thyroid disease basically is a condition which is prevalent all over the world. In some areas of the world, it is quite significant. In others, it is less. In vast majorities of areas, basically, it is because of iodine deficiency. And the amount of iodine deficiency which is there varies from continent to continent. In the Western countries, they have basically taken care of this iodine deficiency, and therefore we rarely find iodine deficiency as a cause of thyroid disease. In India, in some areas of India, it is widespread, but our data basically is not very strong for us to basically chart out the exact areas where this problem is there. I'm finding a little difficulty in going further with my slides. Vishal, can I have something of all this taken off from my
Sir, you
screen?
have to click on the, I think, keyboard key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is going back, right? Yeah, okay, got it. But I need something here which says waiting room. I want that waiting room taken out because it's.
You can minimize, sir. You can minimize that.
That's not getting minimized. That's the problem. All right, fine, got it.
Right.
So again, it's come back again. That's right. So that thing I don't want it here. It's filling up my screen, and therefore I cannot read my slide.
You can minimize, sir, because this will come actually because participants are joining.
Yeah, so I don't want that. Can you take that off because I can't read my slide?
Sir, you look for the down arrow, click on it, and there's a small down arrow there. On the upper left corner of the waiting room, click on the down arrow and say minimize it or close it. Anybody does?
Yeah, okay, 1 minute. Got it. Fine. All right. So thyroid disease is amongst the commonest endocrine diseases worldwide, in which hypothyroidism is a common health problem in India. Thyroid hormones, as we know, control metabolism, growth, body temperatures, menstrual cycles, the functioning of the lungs, heart, and muscle strength, and even other ancillary vital organs. Thyroid disorder is a silent disease where the symptoms, again, the same problem, are subtle and may often be overlooked during examination. Iodine is an essential micronutrient required for normal thyroid function, growth, and development. In India, sub-Himalayan region, especially from Kashmir to Assam, is the well-recognized area of endemic thyroid problems. A clinical survey which was conducted in North India showed that North India has the maximum cases of hypothyroidism. Apart from that, milder form of hypothyroidism, where the diagnosis is made unexpectedly, emerged as the most prevalent thyroid disorder across the country. Vishal, I'm having a problem with this. This thing is not, I cannot move my slide. I cannot see my slides.
Sir, this is not from Zoom. I think something happened with your laptop.
Shall I restart?
You can close your PPT and restart if you want. Yeah, it's coming now. Can you? So can you share your screen again?
Yeah, I'm going to do that right away.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to share my screen again now. Can you see that screen now?
Yes, sir, we can see. Just press F5.
I've got it now.
Right, we can.
Fine, this is better. That's right. Correct. But again, the same thing, all the other things are coming on top of my screen, the remote control, the annotations, etc. So I cannot see anything of my slide. This is the first time this is happening. Why is this like this?
So you have shared your screen. That's why it's coming, I think, today.
All right. Okay. All right. So now first let's discuss hypothyroidism in adults. Now, amongst adult people in India, the prevalence of hypothyroidism has recently been studied. So there was a population study done in Cochin on 971 adult subjects, and they found that the prevalence of hypothyroidism was about 3.9%. In addition to that, there's something called subclinical hypothyroidism, and this was also very high in this study. And this was about 9.5%, 4% overall. So although clinical hypothyroidism was only about 4%, subclinical hypothyroidism, which could later probably develop into hypothyroidism, was about 9.5%. In this subgroup, women accounted for 11.5%, and in men, it was about 6.2%. And this prevalence of subclinical hypothyroidism increased with age. Now, we all know about the symptoms of hypothyroidism. They have varied symptoms, but as far as today's topic is concerned, what we are really worried about is, one is weight gain, second is constipation, and thirdly is the increased fatigue, which is seen in these patients. What about hyperthyroidism? Now we have found that subclinical overt hyperthyroidism were present in 1.6 and 1.3% of subjects participating in a community survey, which was reported by Menon et al. In a hospital-based study of women from Pondicherry, subclinical and overt hypothyroidism were present in 0.6 to 1.2% of subjects. So these two studies tell us that anywhere between 0.5 to 1.5% of the general population could suffer from a hyperthyroidism condition. And as far as hyperthyroidism is concerned, their symptoms again are very varied. And here what we are really worried about is the hypertrophy of the muscles, you understand, and development of osteoporosis, which can cause gait disturbances, can cause muscle problems, which can cause also chronic venous insufficiency. So if we consider what is the relation between thyroid disorder and cardiovascular function, we'll see both hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. They have been the focus of studies in most diverse areas of health sciences because of the repercussions of various parts of the human body. Some studies have related hypothyroidism to muscle dysfunction. Here the problem seems to lie in the lower activity of the enzymes which are involved in the aerobic as well as the anaerobic glucose mechanisms. Reduced mitochondrial activity also occurs with subsequent abnormal muscle energy metabolism. And we all know that skeletal muscle is one of the primary targets for thyroid hormones, and especially the calf muscle. We know that thyroid dysfunction alters the ability of the calf muscle pump to function effectively, thus contributing to venous insufficiency. In this graph, we see very clearly that as far as the contraction of the calf muscle and its subsequent relaxation is concerned, in hypothyroidism, relaxation is very, very delayed. And obviously, this leads to increased ambulatory venous hypertension, leading to signs and symptoms of chronic venous disease. There has also been an association which has been seen venous insufficiency and thyroid dysfunction in the form of thrombosis. First of all, hypothyroidism. It has been suggested that hypothyroidism may be associated with decreased coagulability. A decreased protein synthesis is associated with reduced coagulability in hypothyroidism. This is because of a prolonged kephalin time and abnormally low anti-hemophilic A factor value. Hypothyroidism is also known to increase the bleeding rate. On the other hand, controversially, a few recent studies have also suggested that subclinical hypothyroidism may have a prothrombotic effect. This is a study which was done by Denescu in 2009, in which he studied a large number of patients, large cohort of patients, and he concluded that hypothyroidism is associated with an increased risk of venous thromboembolism. Another study which was done by Ramagopalan in 2011, and this also concluded that hypothyroidism is associated with an increased risk of venous thromboembolism. On the other hand, hyperthyroidism, which is there, is also associated with various venothromboembolism conditions. For example, it has an impact on blood coagulation and fibrinolytic factors. We know that hyperthyroidism is known to be associated with a hypercoagulable state and also known to increase the risk of venous thromboembolic events. The high levels of free thyroxine which are present they cause production of procoagulant proteins, increasing the risk of venous thrombosis. And we all know that the higher the levels of thyroxine, the higher the risk of venous thrombosis, well proved in various studies. This is a study which was done by Coote and published in 2012, in which he studied 587 patients who had overt hyperthyroidism. And the conclusion was the incidence of VT in patients with hyperthyroidism is higher than expected. Another study by Deckers in 2017 again came to the same conclusion that patients with hyperthyroidism had an increased risk of venous thromboembolism. However, there was one contradictory study which was done by Kim in 2013, and this was published in the Internal Medicine Journal. And this showed in a study of 428 patients that the absolute risk of VT in acute hyperthyroidism is low. So more studies which show it was high, and one particular study by Kim which was contradictory to the other results. So you sum up whatever evidence, little evidence that we have, we can conclude that supporting studies show and suggest that hyperthyroidism is associated with a greater risk of venous thromboembolism. Few studies have also suggested that hypothyroidism will also lead to venous thromboembolism. Obviously, venous thromboembolism basically means that leads to DVT with subsequent resolution, non-resolution of DVT, the rise in the ambulatory venous hypertension, in some cases secondary varicose veins, and all the other problems leading to chronic venous disease. Now, what about the association of thyroid disease and chronic in actual clinical practice on a day-to-day basis? So as Dr. Khanna said, there's only one report which has come out recently and which was published in December 2018 by George, etc. And here what they did was, they did a cross-sectional study in order to evaluate if patients with chronic venous insufficiency had a higher prevalence of hypothyroidism as compared to the general population. Exactly what I was thinking is the number of patients who are presenting to us with venous diseases, is hypothyroidism or any form of thyroid disease higher than the general population. These guys studied hypothyroidism. And what did they conclude? They concluded that there is a higher prevalence of hypothyroidism, 17%, in the patients with chronic venous insufficiency compared to the 2 to 5% described for the general population in the literature. So this gave us some idea that yes, there is somebody else also who's thinking in the similar lines. And what about our own practice? So what we basically did is we evaluated 4,540 patients who presented to us over a period of 1 year in our clinic for consultation for venous diseases. And here Serdia Pharmaceuticals was very helpful in doing the statistical analysis for us to find out whether patients, there was any association or not. And we went by the null hypothesis theory. The null hypothesis theory, what is this null hypothesis theory when you want to prove or disprove something? The background of null hypothesis, for some of you who may not be aware, says that there is no statistical significance between the two variables. That is what you start off with, saying that there is no association. It is usually the hypothesis a researcher or experimenter will try to disapprove or credit. So we assume that the null hypothesis is correct until we have enough evidence to suggest otherwise. After you perform a hypothesis test, there are two possible outcomes. When your p-value is less than or equal to your significance level, you reject the null hypothesis. And the data therefore favors the alternative hypothesis. So this is the hypothesis that we used to find out from our series of 4,550 patients whether there was any association between chronic disease, venous disease, and thyroid disease. So what did you find? The first thing is there association of thyroid dysfunction and varicose veins? You will see from above is the table of thyroid, yes, no, and total number of patients. And on the left-hand side, varicose, yes, no, and the total number of patients. And from this statistical analysis, we found that the p-value was less than 0.001, which is very significant. And this estimate indicates that the odds of thyroid disease is 3.0112 times higher in the varicose veins group. So definitely an association, strong association was there, that those patients who presented with varicose veins in the group of patients presenting to us, there the thyroid disease was 3 times more likely than the patients who did not have varicose veins. Number one. Number two, Was there an association between thyroid disease and varicose veins and the age groups? Because as you saw earlier in one of the series, it was shown that at increasing age, the incidence of thyroid disease was higher. But was this association also higher between varicose veins and thyroid? And here the association was, the p-value was 0.0145. Because it is less than alpha of 0.05, again it is significant. So we conclude, yes, there is an association between thyroid disease and age groups. The higher the age group, the higher the association between this condition. Thirdly, is there an association between thyroid disease and gender, between male and female groups? Here again, if you see this chart and you see the final value, the p-value is less than 0.0001, very, very significant. And we conclude that the odds of thyroid disease is 0.1386 times higher in females. So 3 basic points we have found, and all 3 basic points association has been confirmed in our limited series. So to conclude, friends, here, 3 messages here are that evidence from literature suggests that there may be an association between thyroid disease and venous thromboembolism leading to chronic venous disease. As clinicians, we need to be aware of the possibility of thyroid disease as an underlying risk factor for venous insufficiency. Management of patients with thyroid dysfunction and venous insufficiency therefore requires a multidisciplinary approach. We have shown in our limited series that incidence of thyroid disease is higher in patients with chronic venous disease. It's higher in females, and this association increases with age. Obviously, one particular series doesn't prove anything, and many more studies are required to explore and establish a concrete relationship between venous insufficiency and thyroid dysfunction. So that concludes my first talk on thyroid disease and venous insufficiency. And as Dr. Khanna suggested, we will take the questions at the end of both the talks. Is that right, Dr. Khanna?
Yeah,
Can we have a few questions at this time?
As you wish, as you wish, as you wish.
Sir, I wanted to know something about that what type of the thyroid dysfunctions were there in the patient with CVI? It was a hypo or it was hyper?
Both. In our patients, it was hypo. It was basically hypo. A very small number of patients were hyper.
Okay, and does it make any difference between the SEEP classification and the thyroid dysfunction which was there? Like if it is somebody
Right.
C2 is there,
Yeah.
then it is different, and if it is C6 is there, it is different.
Right. So we found that patients who had C4, see, basically there is an association between C4 to C6 disease and thyroid dysfunction and presence of venous ulcers. Unfortunately, number of cases which were there are much less to assume statistical significance. We need at least 3 times the number of patients. And therefore, as per the statisticians, this particular series volume itself was not enough to achieve a statistical analysis. So we'll probably have to enroll as many as 15,000 patients in order to achieve a proper statistical analysis and correlation as far as the question that you are asking.
So do you think that it is going to change if you prove that there is a thyroid disorder is there in the treatment of the varicose veins?
No. Yes, in one way, yes, because a lot of patients who come to us, especially ladies, are obese with chronic venous disease. They have never been investigated for thyroid disease, and they are not taking any treatment for thyroid disease. Their complaints, apart from those related to chronic venous disease, are chronic fatigue and lethargy, etc. As a matter of routine, as a pre-operative case, we are doing thyroid dysfunction in every single patient who's undergoing treatment. And we have picked up a large number of patients, especially ladies, who are found to have been positive for hypothyroidism. So I think, yes, if we incorporate this in our pre-evaluation, it might be worth.
I think Dr. Beji has asked about that. Should we investigate in all patients the thyroid problem?
Yes, I am investigating all patients. Any patient who comes to me with venous insufficiency, I investigate everybody. As I said, that patients are totally unaware that they have thyroid dysfunction. Not only that, once they are, especially patients, ladies over the age of 40, who have been found to have hypothyroidism and have been put on low doses or appropriate doses of thyroxine, 3-4 things occur. One is their weight reduction occurs quite significantly in some patients. The chronic fatigue symptoms which are there decrease. The night cramps decrease. And the symptoms of varicose veins decrease. Now, how do I come to this conclusion without statistical analysis is this? Because a lot of these patients are not willing for any intervention. So a lot of these patients have undergone thyroid treatment, have not undergone definitive venous surgery, and yet the symptoms have improved significantly. So I attribute that to thyroid treatment. So I think patients who come to us and we suspect clinically, we should investigate thyroid. As was shown earlier, up to 4% of patients have hypothyroidism in this country, but 11% of ladies have something called subclinical hypothyroidism. And 1 in 10, I think, is quite high. So I think we should definitely investigate.
I think there's a question from Dr. Bassam is there, who is asking about what are the possible pathogenesis beyond only this association? What do you think? What can be the pathogenesis for that?
See, multiple things. First of all, I think most important, which I find, again, I'm talking on clinical observation, we will need larger study. I think especially when ladies are concerned, it is weight gain, which is very, very important. Because once you develop hypothyroidism and weight gain, it is very difficult to reverse weight gain. So that chronic weight gain, which is there, probably is responsible for some degree of venous insufficiency. Secondly, is that once they develop weight gain, significant weight gain, they become quite sedentary in their activities. And so sedentary activity, as we all know, also contributes. Thirdly, we all know that when there's significant hypothyroidism, the calf muscle pump does not work very well. And if the calf muscle pump is not going to work very well, ambulatory venous hypertension is going to increase. So there are going to be multiple factors, I think, here which are involved in this problem.
Dr. Padaria, I have a small question. If you have planned some patient for any type of the treatment in the varicose vein, RF ablation or EVLT or any sort of the modality, and that patient turned out a uncontrolled hypothyroidism. Uncontrolled hypothyroidism. Suppose the TSH turns out 100 or more than 100. Do you delay the treatment or you go?
No, so we basically first send them back to, I don't normally treat the hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. I send them to a physician. They usually come back within a month or so, month or 6 weeks, because the majority of patients or ablation, there is not an emergency case. It is basically an elective procedure. So they will come back with, and that's the reason I said that when they do come back, a lot of them do come back for the treatment, but when they come back maybe 4 or 6 weeks later, the severity of the symptoms have decreased quite significantly after treatment. So some of their symptoms are obviously because of the thyroid dysfunction.
I think somebody is asking about, his name is not here, that should we investigate all patients suspected of the subclinical thyroid disease along with the CVI?
No, subclinically, I don't know. But as I said, the whole idea of subclinical is there are no symptoms. Correct. You will find out only on testing. So as a matter of routine, as I said earlier, every single patient who undergoes any form of ablative therapy in our center, the pre-operative test thyroid is 100% done. In fact, to give you an idea that any patient who also has diabetes now undergoes a nerve conduction study in our center. The reason being is that that's the next part of my talk, which I will on nerve injuries. A lot of the symptoms of paresthesia which are present in a patient of varicose veins, chronic venous disease who comes to us pre-treatment, they sometimes don't disappear after treatment, and we may attribute basically it to the laser or whatever it is. In diabetic patients, actually, if we can show that this was already there prior to the treatment, then it is helpful for us also in charting the recovery of that patient.
Dr. Fakhri is asking the same question which I asked, that is it going to change the management of the patient with the CVI?
Definitely,
he says that if you give the patient the treatment, will his progression of CVI will stop or not?
I personally definitely think that the progression of CVI will be arrested because of the factors which are there because of the thyroid disease. For example, sir, if you have a patient of significant hypothyroidism, as Dr. Agarwal said, who has no idea that the patient has hypothyroidism, is very obese, is very lethargic, who's sedentary, And as you know, after proper treatment, the activity increases, weight loss occurs. So I definitely think that we have to do a multidisciplinary approach as far as of chronic venous disease treatment is concerned. Apart from ablative therapy, thyroid dysfunction treatment should be taken care of. Yes.
And then Dr. Fakhri has suggested that, for the pathogenesis, that there can be gene consequences in both the disease. So we have to study between any association or gene consequences which are there, which may be responsible for this association.
So, sir, this particular lecture I gave in Krakow in Poland last year, and there were almost about 80 to 100 people who were listening to it. And the discussion went on for a very long time because this was absolutely a new concept. And really, there is absolutely no papers on this, no detailed study done on this. So obviously, a lot more work will have to be done on various facets of this condition: hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, subclinical disease, whether long-term management changes any aspect of this or not. So I think, sir, this is basically a push to generate interest amongst people to do further research in this particular area.
So in the same term, Dr. Usha Rani has asked that, do you recommend the thyroid function test in all CVI patients?
I do. I
think that's the questions which are in the chat box. Please, now you can go for your second lecture on nerve injury, please.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Can you see the screen share now?
Yeah, now we can see. Yeah, yes,
okay,
we can see that here. Yeah.
So friends, the next part of my talk is basically something on nerve damage during endovenous thermal ablation. A lot of us are doing various forms of treatment for varicose veins, thermal treatment, non-thermal treatment, etc. But as far as thermal treatment is concerned, one of the side effects of this particular therapy is nerve damage, which is sometimes underestimated by us. Sometimes it can create a lot of problems for us. So nerve damage, as Dr. Khanna told you in the introduction, is the most common cause of litigation and procedures involving varicose vein surgery or ablation. And it can occur quite often. In fact, some degree of saphenous nerve injury, whether mild or even moderate, can be seen in up to 37% of patients, while sural nerve injury can be seen in almost 5% of patients. Now, what are the consequences of nerve injury? In the vast majority of cases, it's a sensory loss to the areas which are innervated by the saphenous and the sural nerves. There is usually paresthesia and dysesthesia, which spontaneously resolves within a few months. However, if the motor nerves, such as the tibial nerve or the common peroneal nerve, is damaged, then foot drop can occur, and this can be catastrophic, this can be permanent. Now, whenever one starts doing any form of laser therapy, the first question which anybody asks is this laser energy going to burn off my skin? Is it going to cause permanent damage to my muscles? And so this was a very nice study which was done by Beal et al. Published in Phlebology 2006. And what they did was they took 12 patients who were treated by endovenous laser of the long saphenous vein after tumescent anesthesia. And they placed thermocouples at 3 millimeters, 5 millimeters, and 10 millimeters away from the wall of the long saphenous vein. Now, in this experimental model, when they actually started giving the laser, the intravascular temperature of 1334 degrees centigrade was recorded. That is within the vessel itself. But what about outside? And here is the result. So the thermocouple, which was 3 millimeters away from the vein wall, the temperature was only 34.5 degrees centigrade. Thermocouple, which was 5 millimeters away from the vein wall, the temperature was 33.7 degrees centigrade. And that which was 1 centimeter, that is 10 millimeters away from the vein wall, the temperature was only 31.1 degrees centigrade. And this laid to rest the big scare, the fear in people that laser will actually damage all the surrounding tissue. The important thing that we learned from here is that if adequate delivery of tumescent anesthesia is given, then you can avoid damage to the surrounding tissue because the temperature does not travel that far. Now, how does the nerve actually get injured? And there are three mechanisms. One is the needle stick injury during vein cannulation. Actually, doing the cannulation of the vein, instead of hitting the nerve, you will hit the, instead of hitting the vein, you will hit the nerve. And the patient usually complains of sudden excruciating pain. Secondly is the needle injury to the nerve during administration of tumescent anesthesia. We feel that once you've cannulated the vein, that is enough, but the tumescent anesthesia can also give rise to a problem because of needle. And thirdly, the heat transfer during endovenous thermal ablation. And this problem nowadays will only occur if you have not given adequate amount of tumescent anesthesia. The important thing is the tumescent anesthesia should be given very, very well. Now, there are certain strategies which we must know to prevent nerve injury whenever we're doing a procedure. First is you must know the anatomic position of the veins and nerves. Very, very important, because this will help us to determine the level of entry site into the vein when doing a procedure. Secondly, and very important, observe the vein and nerve by ultrasound, not only during cannulation, but also when you're delivering the anesthetic agent. Thirdly, whenever you're putting the needle, either for cannulation or for anesthesia, withdraw it immediately if the patient has sharp pain. Sharp pain means you've hit a nerve. And lastly, once again, I'm stressing, give good amount of tumescent anesthesia to adequately separate the nerves from the vein. Which are the important nerves in the leg that we have to worry about? The two most important ones I said earlier are the saphenous nerve and the sural nerve, but apart from that also the tibial nerve and the common peroneal nerve. Let us first discuss saphenous neuropathy following endovenous laser ablation. Now, it's as Dr. Khanna said earlier, it's not necessary that during laser only is damaged. This can be occur even during surgery. It has been shown that great saphenous vein stripping, nerve injury was seen in almost 5% of patients. And in small saphenous vein stripping, nerve injury was seen in 2.5%. And if you strip the entire vein out, the damage is even higher. Now, as far as the saphenous nerve itself is concerned, four studies have reported that damage can occur between 1 to 36.5% of limbs. Now, 36.5 suddenly sounds very large, but this is all very mild to moderate and very transient. If you see the last line of this slide in red, you will read that at 6 months, this was only 2.8%. And at the end of the study, at 1 year, it was 0. It had totally disappeared. So all this is very, very mild. Now, why does this occur? Because of the anatomical relationship between the saphenous vein and the superficial nerves. In the region of the thigh, the great saphenous vein is rarely associated closely with the saphenous nerve. There's a great distance between them. But just below the knee, in the leg, about 5 centimeters below, the great saphenous vein frequently runs along the saphenous nerve. In the middle third of the leg, in almost 60% of patients, and the lower third of the leg, almost 83% of the patients. And sometimes it may be covered by a single covering. So in the lower part of the leg, actually the chances of damage are much higher. So if you see this cross section of the saphenous nerve, you see above the knee, they are separated, the nerve and the vein. But below the knee, they are in the same compartment. So there the chance of damage is definitely higher. Here you will see again here above the knee, there's a significant difference between the saphenous nerve and the saphenous vein. But again, there's almost up to 3 centimeters difference. But below the knee, they come quite close together in the same facial compartment. If by mistake, the saphenous nerve does get damaged, what happens? Where is the sensory loss? The sensory loss usually occurs in the medial aspect of the calf, around the ankle and the foot. And normally the patient will tell you that mujhe kuch pata nahi chalta. I can't feel anything here. Usually there is no dysesthesia. It is usually loss of sensation. This is seen, mild degree of this is seen in many, many patients. And especially if they're diabetics, this will be seen more. But as I said earlier, within 3 to 6 months, it disappears by itself. As a matter of routine, at the first month of follow-up, if the patient complains of this, we give a little bit of pregabalin, and the patients are usually comfortable with this treatment. How about the entry point into the long saphenous vein for thermal ablation? Where should you go? As I said earlier, you go not more than 4 to 5 centimeters below the knee. Try to not go below that, and which should always be done under ultrasound guidance. Tedkin in 2010 at the European Venous Forum did a study on North American patients, and these were usually average height was about 6 feet 1, 76 kilos in the body weight, and he said that the entry into the GSV should be at least 19 centimeters above the medial malleolus. It was true in that population. Our population is different, heights are different, weights are different. So I don't think that this basically will work in our Indian population. The next nerve we need to consider is the sural nerve. Sural nerve damage can occur because of laser in up to about 4.5% of patients. Now, sural nerve injury, when it occurs, it can cause numbness, but this is a little troublesome numbness. It is dysesthesia. Not only that, it can also cause significant burning and pain in the heel and the lateral aspect of the foot. This is much more severe and disturbing to the patient than damage to the saphenous nerve. And therefore, this nerve should be avoided, damage to this nerve should be avoided as far as possible. If you see the sural nerve here, if the damage does occur, as I said, it occurs in the lateral aspect of the calf, lateral aspect of the ankle and the foot, and most importantly, burning pain in the heel. Now, when the sural nerve comes down, it has a medial branch and a lateral branch. And there are different variations of these branches. Important point to note is that these branches are usually away from the vein in the upper part of the calf, but closer to the vein in the mid and the lower part of the calf. And that is the reason for minimizing treatment of the short saphenous vein below the inferior border of the gastrocnemius muscle. So you see the laser tip should not go below this particular level, which is shown here. So as I said, there are some anatomical variations in the termination of the short saphenous vein also, because it's during the treatment of the short saphenous vein that you're going to damage the sural nerve. In 60% of cases, the short saphenous vein enters the popliteal vein at the popliteal fossa, either directly or after joining the gastrocnemius vein. In 25% of cases, it ends above the popliteal fossa. In that case, it might go into the GSV, which is commonly known as the Giancommini vein. It might go directly into a perforator vein in the posterior thigh, or it may join into the gluteal vein. In 15% of cases, the SSV terminates into a deep vein of the posterior thigh via perforating vein. And rarely it may terminate below the popliteal fossa. Here, if you see that this is the short saphenous vein going down, and if you see in the upper part of the calf, this is the sural nerve, and this is the short saphenous vein. There's a significant distance between the two. But as you keep going down in the lower part of the calf, you will see this is the short saphenous vein here, and this is the sural nerve here. And I'll show you a small video which will show it even more conclusively here. So if you see here, this is a short saphenous vein, and that is the sural nerve. The sural nerve you can make out because it's very dense, and it has components basically which are hypo and hyper echoic, and waiting for this to play a little bit there. So if you see now, that's the short saphenous vein, and that's the sural nerve. It's just below the knee joint, and you will see that there's a difference between, quite a significant difference between. But as you come around the ankle, they tend to come closer to each other. If you have a high frequency ultrasound machine, will see this very well. And you'll differentiate between the two, because as you press the transducer, you can compress the short saphenous vein, but the nerve cannot be compressed. So that confirms that this is the vein and this is the nerve. Again, as you go up towards the knee joint, you see the distance between the two is increasing. So very nice demonstration that with a good ultrasound machine, you can visualize the nerve as well as the vein. Again, Ted King said that entry into the short saphenous vein should be 26 centimeters above the floor of the foot. In our population, again, that's a little difficult too. The next nerve which is of importance is the tibial nerve. We know where the tibial nerve comes from. So this is the sciatic nerve, this is the branch of the tibial nerve, come here, that's the popliteal artery. And especially if we go very close to the treatment of the short saphenous vein, as it joins the popliteal vein, there's a chance of damaging the tibial nerve. Now, when damage occurs to the tibial nerve, remember, This is a motor and sensory nerve. And here you can have a problem. The patient will not be able to plantar flex, cannot stand on the tiptoes. There'll be no sensation to soles of the foot. This can be permanent in a large number of patients. You have to be very, very careful in such patients. And therefore, when you're doing a ablation of the short saphenous vein, very important not to go very, very proximal up to the point of the popliteal vein. Avoid the popliteal artery and vein. You know the tibial nerve and the vein line close proximity. Start the thermal ablation just before the SSV dips down through the deep facial sheath. And this is usually about 2 to 3 centimeters from the SP junction. If the reflux in the short saphenous vein begins in the thigh extension, then please ablate this segment also. This is very, very important. However, limit your ablation to the intrafacial portion of the thigh extension to avoid nerve injury. But a lot of other nerves are there in the mid and the lower thigh. You don't want to damage them also. Similarly, you should also avoid the damage to the peroneal nerve. Also, it's a motor and sensory nerve. Foot drop can occur. And again, there'll be no sensation to the top of the foot. Peroneal nerve, these two nerves are tibial nerve are very, very important. The common peroneal nerve injury can occur in almost 5% during surgery of the short saphenous vein. The higher the termination of the SP junction, the closer it is, the CPM, and therefore be very, very careful how close you go to the deeper vein when you're closing the short saphenous vein. And this is where the eye of the vein, the nerve occurs, where the damage can occur. And this is where the common peroneal, there's the lateral aspect of the knee joint. That red line shows the danger area, and that's one area where you might avoid. If you have varicose in this area, one is try and do foam sclerotherapy. Many physicians who attempt ambulatory phlebectomy here in this particular lateral aspect of the knee joint here can have a problem damaging this nerve. So be very, very careful. Lastly, I'd like to stress on something called sciatic nerve varices. Not very commonly known condition, quite a rare condition. What is this sciatic vein? An incompetent sciatic vein appears very similar to the short saphenous vein. It's an intrafacial vein which runs lateral to the short saphenous vein in the calf, then goes deeper at the lateral popliteal fossa as it enters the deep thigh compartment to follow the course of the sciatic nerve all the way up here and can go all the way up to the gluteal fold. Now, damage to this, you may feel that this is a large vein going all the way up here, and you may try to ablate that. And if you try to do a thermal ablation of this, because sometimes you can mistake this for a cranial extension of the short saphenous vein, but that will be more medial, this will be much more lateral. We try to do that, it's a very good chance you'll damage the sciatic nerve. The pain which occurs because of that in patients, one of my colleagues has done that, I've seen that patient, we finally proved that on nerve conduction studies, is excruciating pain, and it takes months and months and months to go down. So in conclusion, friends, very important that know your nerve anatomy before doing endovenous thermal ablation. Try to visualize the nerves by ultrasound before cannulation. And when the nerve cannot be visualized by ultrasound, then make sure, as per Dr. Ted King's studies, entry into the GSV should be 19 centimeters at least above the medial malleolus. Entry into the short saphenous vein should be at least 26 millimeters above the floor of the foot. The more distal the entry into the long saphenous vein and the short saphenous vein, the greater the chance of nerve injury. If you have to treat the lower part of the long saphenous vein and the short saphenous vein, you can do glue therapy, you can do foam sclerotherapy, correct? I do both of that. Although with increasing experience, I'm sure you can even go up to the ankle with thermal treatment as long as you use good amount of anesthesia and you can visualize the nerves well. And lastly, once again, use generous amounts of tumescent anesthesia adequately because it helps to separate the veins and nerves and helps to prevent complications. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Swara Padaria. We have a question from Dr. Basan asking about whether 1470 versus 980 or linear versus radial tips make any difference in causing nerve damage, and also wants to know about recommendation of non-thermal vein ablation for short saphenous vein.
So as far as the first one is concerned, between 980 and 1470, when I started doing lasers in 2003, that was the only laser which was available. That was a 980 biolitic laser fiber which I used. We used it for a few years until 1470 came in. And now, you know, because of laser mechanics and we know that the effectiveness of laser of 1470 is much better than of 980. Not only that, rather than the bare laser fiber, the radial laser fiber and the double radial tip fibers are much better. So with advancing technology, I think as of today, there is no doubt that the 1470 results are much better than the 980. Not only as far as the efficacy of laser is concerned, but also because of the pain component which is there, which is much higher in the 980, is almost negligible in the 1470. As far as the second part of your question is concerned, what about non-tumescent, non-thermal techniques for lower part of the GSV and the SSV? I 100% agree with you that they are effective techniques and can be used quite well, and the chance of nerve injury is much less. Having said that, I must also say that sometimes the GSV size at the level of the ankle may be almost 5 millimeters in diameter, because the reflux is very large right from top. And if you ablate the great saphenous vein only up to the below the knee and do foam sclerotherapy below that, it really is not very, very effective. And therefore, in such cases where the size of the vein is more than 3.5 to 4 millimeters, I go all the way up to the ankle with thermal ablation using a large amount of tumescent. I have very good ultrasound GE machine, very good probes, and we adequately visualize the vein. We can see the nerves almost in all the patients. Short saphenous vein, I would strongly advise those who are not very experienced in endovenous laser that stop in the mid cuff, don't go below the mid cuff. Your entry point also try and keep at that particular level. If there is a perforator, large mid cuff perforator, try and go below the level of the mid cuff perforator, not above the level of the mid cuff perforator. Because many a times what happens is that there is a reflux in the mid cuff perforator, and that gives rise to problems in the ankle area, especially lateral aspects. If you treat the short saphenous vein to below the mid cuff perforator, that problem is solved. Lower part of the ankle, you can very well inject foam, because once you close the short saphenous vein and the mid cuff perforator, the point of joining of the mid cuff perforator, the short saphenous vein, the size of the vein below that drops drastically. A little bit of amount of foam sclerosant gives very, very good results.
We have a question from Dr. Harinder. Any difference between RFA versus laser in nerve damage?
Right. Again, as far as the treatment is concerned of the great saphenous vein up to the knee joint or just below the knee joint and the proximal short saphenous vein, I have found absolutely no difference between both RFA and short saphenous and the laser. But when you are treating from the ankle upwards, the GSV, or you're treating sometimes the lower part of the short saphenous vein, then I find that the RFA fiber is much thicker, and I would rather go with a laser. That is a personal observation of mine. I cannot prove it in any way. I think each one will have their own conclusions.
But Shoaib, don't you think with the RFA the temperature is actually much lower, isn't it? If your main reason for the pathology after the needle stick is the temperature, in RFA much lower.
Yeah, so the basic thing is like this, as I showed in that slide by Beal. If you give good amount of tumescent anesthesia and you really layer that vein very well with tumescent anesthetic, you will find that the vein and the fiber is only a small component in the center. The whole rest of the area is only tumescent anesthesia. So temperature travel does not occur at all, absolutely at all. We did a series which we unfortunately haven't yet published of 100 consecutive patients or non-diabetic patients in whom we did lasers from the ankle upwards, all the way upwards. And we did a nerve conduction study before and nerve conduction study later. And we found absolutely no difference at 3 months. There was a flaw in the machine of the parameters for doing the nerve conduction. And therefore, we could not publish that study. We'll be doing that study again. But from what we know, there was no difference at all in thermal ablation with lasers.
There is a question from not identified called iPhone. Name is not there. How can we manage the remaining disease segments of the veins below 19 centimeter and 26 centimeter that is near the nerves?
So as we said, we use various forms of techniques. You can use foam sclerotherapy, which is the most common, the most effective, the most easy to do. And a lot of my colleagues in Western countries nowadays are using glue for this. I think these are the two techniques which are commonly used.
Question from Dr. Usharani. Should we do a nerve conduction study in foot drop patients following surgery? How do you treat such patients?
Foot drop obviously means it's a nerve problem. You'll have to do it for medical legal purposes. Now, how that's really going to alter your management in a patient who's already had a foot drop is a little difficult to say, because in spite of all sorts of medical treatment, very few patients of foot drop actually recover. There are some patients who undergo nerve transposition, and some encouraging results have been seen, but I have seen no Indian papers on this. I don't know, Dr. Bedi, whether he has any experience in this.
Actually, they are very, I mean, I've never come across, frankly, a patient with, other than paresthesia, which you mentioned, which disappears at 6 months, 1 year.
Yeah.
So luckily, either my patients or my colleagues, I have never come across. Maybe we are doing a better job.
Yeah, Harinder, I saw one patient about 2-3 years ago, and this patient actually had surgery done, a vein surgery done, and he had come with a foot drop. But again, as I said, this was in literature, and there was only this one patient I've seen in all my years of practice. So yeah, I think it's
Can I
very rare.
request Dr. Ayman to please give his experience, if I may be allowed to?
Yes.
Thank you. I like the presentation very much. It was very good presentation indeed. Thank you, Daria. Regarding nerve injury, I completely agree with what you said. Yes, there will be sometimes nerve injury if you go down to the knee, and in particular in small saphenous abrasion, we can find some cases if we go below the mid calf. That's why I prefer to stop at these levels and do sclerotherapy.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you,
I agree.
Thank you, Doctor. There's another question from iPhone, which says, what choices we have to manage sciatic vein? I think it has been answered. Dr. Padaria, you have anything to say?
So as I said, the most important thing here, I would say, is that nerve anatomy we must know very well, and vein anatomy first. Although variations in the veins are very, very common.
Question is on sciatic vein management.
Yes. No, so we must know that the short saphenous vein, there are a lot of anatomical variations. It can go all the way up to the great saphenous vein. That's known as the Giancomini vein. It can do mid thigh, etc. But you must know that if you take the thigh, the posterior thigh, you see this short saphenous vein will usually be either in the mid segment or the medial segment. It will not be in the lateral segment of the thigh. If any vein you're seeing going laterally, then that is highly unlikely to be a short saphenous vein. And therefore, you must do a good sonography. The sciatic nerve is very well seen on a high frequency ultrasound. You can see it very well. As we see nerve, and secondly, this vein which is there, I have not actually seen it myself, but I've seen a couple of videos on the net, and it seems to be almost like a corkscrew appearance of the vein which goes around the sciatic nerve. So that is one thing. And the other thing is that in Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, sometimes you have this, large vein going laterally and can be very, very close to the sciatic nerve. And nowadays, a lot of us, treat this either with thermal ablation or whichever. So if you're doing thermal ablation for that segment of the vein, then you have to be careful of the sciatic nerve.
There's a question on skin changes due to varicose veins. It is not related to the topic, but would you like to answer?
What sort of skin changes? I mean, what is the question?
Changes due to varicose veins disappear after ablation, and if so, how long does it take to disappear, Dr. Subramanian?
So first of all, I would say that I tell all my patients that skin changes are not going to disappear. Skin changes are permanent. And that is true, I would say, for 90% of patients. You may find that some degree of pigmentation of the skin, maybe 1 or 2 grades might decrease. If you are lucky, it might decrease more. But in 90% of patients, it will remain more or less the same. What will change is the quality of the skin.
Dr. Prerna, please mute your phone. Dr. Prerna.
So the hard skin which is there, the mottled skin which is there will become smooth, it will become nice. But color wise, I don't encourage patients that this will improve. If it improves, good luck to them. So I don't think that's basically it.
You are very right.
Thank you. Then one last question there. What are the complementary supplements that can be given?
So as I said earlier, in my practice, because we tend to do the entire procedure at one go using a lot of combination techniques, I will use laser, I use foam sclerotherapy, I use ambulatory phlebectomy, I use everything so the patient walks out with a clean leg at the end of the procedure. I would say that almost 20 to 30% of my patients will have some degree, even mild, of paresthesia or dysesthesia following the treatment. This will basically persist for anywhere between 1 month to 3 months. Very rarely it will persist to 6 months. If I feel that I have done some extensive work, as a matter of routine, I will give all these patients 75 milligrams of pregabalin for a period of 1 month initially. All of them, if necessary for 3 months. Rather than wait for them to come back with complaints of paresthesia and then start the treatment. And this has worked quite well now. Since the last 3-4 years, we have been doing this. In diabetic patients, as a matter of routine, I give everybody pregabalin.
Maybe can we ask Sardia to give a combined tablet of pregabalin along with Daflon?
So that's a good point, because I'll tell you honestly that many years ago, I don't remember, 5-6 years ago, we did a small series of patients. I think about 30 or 40% in each. In one group, we gave patients at that time 1000 milligrams Daflon was, now that was 500 milligrams. We gave them 500 milligrams of Daflon twice a day for 3 months following every treatment. In the other group of patients, we didn't give them Daflon. Now, this was not properly randomized or anything. This was just an observational study. But we found that the patients who took Daflon twice a day were definitely much more comfortable than the patients who did not take Daflon. And therefore now, as a matter of routine, every single patient of ours gets Daflon 1000 milligrams at night after dinner for 3 months following any interventional treatment. That's a routine treatment.
Any questions or any comments from participants and others, please?
I see my friend Professor Ul. If he can hear us, Professor, bonjour. Are you there?
Hello, Arinder. Hi, everybody. Yes.
Hello.
Yes,
hello.
I'm here.
Professor
Yes,
has written a very good atlas, so maybe he can tell us a little bit about venous anatomy vis-a-vis the nerves. Professor.
Yes. That is important point. Sorry, because my video is not working. Yes, no. It's a very important point. All of you know already that the knowledge of anatomy of the nerves is important, of course. And I suggest that everybody makes a very accurate venous and nervous mapping, because you can check with the probe, you can check the nerves, you can check the anatomy, so you can assess the vicinity of the nerves. And this is, I think, the most common point to avoid complications, because if you know that the nerves are very close to the vein, you can avoid. I think with laser, you do not control perfectly what the energy you deliver. So see, if the nerves is close, you could have, in some cases, I think you could have a more frequently complication and nervous injury. So I think the good thing is to check and to make a mapping of the nerves together with the mapping of the veins. And this is the best way, I think. Shoaib, you agree with me?
Yes,
that
yes,
it is
yes.
probably the way to avoid main things.
Yes, correct. Absolutely. And that's the reason why I think Dr. Bedi has picked up this point, because our knowledge of the anatomy is not that accurate. And once we read your atlas and we read your book, we get a very perfect 3-dimensional anatomy idea. And Dr. Bedi, you will agree that Professor's book is mind-boggling. It's phenomenal. Each one of us should have a copy of that book. It will help us a great deal in our practice. Thank you, Professor.
No, next time I come in India, I try to get them to come with some books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You know, the laser is being used left and right by the proctologist. They are doing all type of anal procedures with that laser, but they never give the tumescent anesthesia. And you said that the temperature which is produced in the vein is about more than 1000.
Yeah.
And because the tumescent anesthesia, it comes down to 35 or 40, whatever you say. So how do they get away from this thing?
So what they are doing, I asked them this question last time during the VI conference in Mumbai. And so you will realize that almost every single of these patients is heavily sedated or done under general anesthesia or spinal anesthesia. You understand? And the patients who are being done under very mild sedation, the doctors are giving good amount of tumescent anesthesia. So although in the lectures they say no tumescent anesthesia, if it's very mild and very mild sedation, everybody is giving tumescent. Otherwise, the patient will scream. So they're either giving spinal anesthesia or they are giving general anesthesia or very heavy sedation.
No, but I mean that like in a case of pilonidal sinus, they are doing that. It is so superficial and there is no skin burn in those cases. While in the case of you do it without the tumescent anesthesia, there will be skin burn will be there, which they say that it is not occurring. So I'm not able to actually know that really is it a true or not.
Pilonidal sinus, sir, I have no idea. I don't understand.
Even the fistula, fistula sometimes are very superficial, but they never said that there is a skin burn in after the laser surgery is there.
Yeah, you're right, but maybe we need to study this a little bit. Maybe we need to study this.
May I add something? Yes. Yeah, may I add something? I think that Shoaib said is very important. I think any surgery of the veins should be done under tumescent anesthesia. Why? Because under spinal or even general anesthesia, you can make an injury of the nerves, the patient does not react. So very important thing is under local anesthesia, you have something you have a warning. If you are close to the nerve, you begin to make a lesion of the nerve, the patient reacts. That is the first thing. And second thing, the tumescent anesthesia is enlarging the distance between the vein and the nerve, so you can treat more safely, more securely, because the nerves is not very close. It's and the tumescent anesthesia and local anesthesia, this is very important. This is a very important principle for venous surgery, I think.
I agree, sir. I agree.
And then is there any way of grading the nerve injury? Any classification is there or something like that, so that we can speculate that this nerve is going to recover back or this is going to be permanent?
That's a very good question, sir. I think that is a very good question, but no, I'm not aware of that, whether there's any gradation of nerve injury or not. I'm not really aware of that. But maybe we should ask a neurologist on that.
It has to be studied in the detail.
Yeah.
And does the non-thermal type of the treatments which are there, they also cause the nerve injury or not?
Very good question, sir. Very good question. Now see, as I said in the very, hello?
Yes.
Hello, sorry. Yeah, as I said in the very beginning, what are the causes? What are the reasons? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So what are the reasons for causing nerve injury? One is when you're entering the nerve during cannulation, entering the vein during cannulation, and secondly, a tumescent anesthesia. So suppose you're using a procedure such as Clarivein, for example, correct? You're still introducing a catheter into the vein. So at this point also, when you're entering with that needle into the vein to introduce the catheter, there is a possibility of hitting the nerve. So there is a small chance of nerve injury even during that time. You understand? So I think that one, to say that will never cause nerve injury is not correct.
But sir,
yes.
Most of the time the injury of the nerve is the thermal injury because of this thermal radiation of the vein.
Not necessarily, sir. Sometimes, as you see, if you go very close to the knee joint, you will find you will hit the saphenous nerve, sir. It is well known, just below the knee joint. That's why you should go about 4 or 5 centimeters below the knee joint. Very close, you'll hit that, and just that one single needle injury itself, not the thermal injury, will cause damage to the nerve. Now, this was explained to me by our neurologist who's doing the nerve conduction study, that the problem in the nerve was just below that level, not above that level, the conduction velocities. So therefore, the problem occurred because of the needle stick injury at the point of entry, not because of the thermal injury from the SF junction.
Okay.
So that is also a point to be noted.
And can it be even in the sclerotherapy that your sclerosis, they just go outside the vein and can cause the injury there?
So the problem is depends on the size of the needle. When you are doing all these other procedures, you're using an 18 gauge needle. While for sclerotherapy, you're using a very, very tiny needle.
Butterfly.
Yeah, very small. I mean, I use first 31, 30 gauge needle, 28 gauge needle.
Yes.
So the chance of injury obviously will be lesser, sir.
Will be less. Yes.
Yeah. Any more questions from any comments?
Yes. Yeah. Last question from Dr. Padaria.
Yes.
Dr. Padaria.
Yes.
Whatever we are seeing in your backdrop, the beautiful Bangla, is it your house?
Yes, sir. Most welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was my first comment. That was my first comment.
Thank you, Dr. Padaria, and my co-host, Dr. Khanna, and all the panelists and all the members who have commented and given their valuable information and not sharing the knowledge, and for all the people who have questioned and had a very stimulating meeting today evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Padaria.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.